that your burden? I mean, I understood the government to say that you are bringing this lawsuit and you have to establish standing. And so to the extent we're trying to assess whether or not Mohila is actually going to be injured, I don't think you can answer, but the government hasn't said something about the fees.
Well, my point in bringing that up, Justice Jackson, is that the government hasn't said anything about the fees in responding to what we've already substantiated through the documents we've put in. We have put in documents indicating that this will amount to approximately a 40% loss of operating revenue for Mohila. And in response, the government referenced potential offsetting costs, which they don't quantify, and they don't show that that would significantly reduce the injury that we're anticipating.
Mohila isn't here, General Crawford. Is that correct?
Mohila is not here, but its interests are here.
It has the ability to sue and be sued. It's been set up as an independent corporate entity with the ability to bring suits on its own. Usually we don't allow one person to step into another's shoes and say, I think that that person suffered a harm, even if the harm is very great. We leave it to the person, him or her or itself, to make that judgment. Now here, the state has derived very substantial benefits from setting up Mohila as an independent body with financial distance from the state and sue and be sued authority. So why isn't Mohila responsible for deciding whether to bring this suit?
We don't deny that Mohila could file a suit like that, but the state's interest is directly implicated here, so it is allowed to assert the interest it has in Mohila directly.
But I guess, there are third parties all the time who have an interest in, gosh, I wish that party over there would bring a suit because I have some relationship with that third party, and I would like it very much if that third party represented its own interests better, in my view. But we don't do that. We don't allow that kind of interference with the decision of the entity involved to decide whether the harm is of the kind that they want to sue for.
Well, the government is different. This court has recognized that in cases like Cherry Cotton Mills and Erickson, where it's allowed the federal government to assert the interests of federally created corporations.
I believe that in those cases, the federal government had an independent interest. So the federal government was not saying, oh, we just have an entitlement to stand in the shoes of the federal corporation.
Two responses. The first response is I don't think that's the best reading, certainly, of Cherry Cotton Mills. Cherry Cotton Mills, the court discussed a number of facts, and then at the end said, the reason why the government can assert the federal corporation's interest is because it is performing purely governmental purposes. That's exactly what's happening here. The state of Missouri has declared that everything Mohila does is the performance of an essential public function. So that's the first response. The second response is even if the state does need an interest, the state has an interest here. I'd identify at least three. The first interest is that the state created Mohila to provide financial aid for Missouri students, and that's what it does. The second interest is in the Lewis and Clark Discovery Fund, and the third interest is in the regular contributions that Mohila makes to the state scholarship programs. Now, there was some discussion earlier about the Lewis and Clark Fund and some suggestion that it's a dormant fund that no longer exists. I think it's clear, I think we need to clarify what exactly is the status. So yes, it's true that there hasn't been a contribution in the last 15 years, but that's because the state has negotiated with Mohila for Mohila, in lieu of making the Lewis and Clark contributions, to contribute over $65 million directly to the state scholarship program. And in exchange for those agreements, the state has allowed the Lewis and Clark deadline to be extended. So at this point, the question is, what's going to happen at the next deadline? The next deadline is coming up next year. And if the question before this court is whether cutting Mohila's operating revenue by 40% will increase the risk that it either won't make the next contribution to the Lewis and Clark Fund or it won't make the next payment to the scholarship fund in lieu of the Lewis and Clark Fund.